Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a stack of sources like the one you've shared today and really dig into the most important insights. It's kind of your shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Exactly. And we're here to sort of guide you through that material, help you connect the dots, and, understand why certain things matter without getting totally bogged down.
Today, we are definitely undertaking a deep dive. The subject is Syria, a place with just an incredibly long and, frankly, complex story. Your sources give us this huge sweep, right, from ancient civilizations all the way up to the present day.
It's quite a journey through time, yeah. We'll be looking at how this territory, sitting right at a crucial crossroads, has been shaped really by millennia of empires, different cultures, conflicts, shifts in power, right up to the immense challenges it faces now.
Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack this stack and see what key knowledge nuggets we can pull out. Our mission is to give you the context to really understand Syria's long unfolding story.
Get ready for some surprising connections, I think.
So let's start right at the beginning, because your sources make it so clear Syria's history goes way, way back, deep antiquity. One note highlights, it might even be older as a concept, perhaps, than many other states in the region. There are mentions linked way back to Egypt's third dynasty near this valley of Cognis.
And the sources even float the idea that the name Syria could come from an ancient word meaning an army.
Wow. So that sense of it being a place defined by, well, movement and power struggles starts right there.
It really does. This ancient land quickly becomes a focal point, a nexus for the big powers of the time. The Egyptians, then the Hittites, and the Assyrians.
Right.
Material shows this kind of sequence. Egyptian influence first, then Hittite, then Assyrian. They're all pushing west, making expeditions into this region, trying to get control.
And even before them, the sources point to the Sumerians.
Right.
We think of them in Mesopotamia, obviously, but they were the first major culture there, right? Cities like Uruk, around 4,000 to 2,500 BC.
Yeah, pioneers in large-scale irrigation, agriculture. Enter tells these artificial mounds where settlements were built up over time. That feature gets adopted by later groups, too.
Uruk, especially. The sources link that period, maybe 3,100 to 2,900 BC, to the origins of cuneiform, that incredible early writing.
Right. Cuneiform comes out of the Ubaid period, just before 2,500 BC. Then, around 2,400 BC, you get a Semitic group, the Akkadians, invading Sumer under Sargon.
Sargon, he sounds fascinating in these sources. Seen as prophet, judge, and king. That's quite a combination.
It is. And his stele of victory, recorded in cuneiform, is highlighted. It's through the Akkadians that Sumerian culture, arts like seal cutting, really spread beyond the Euphrates into what becomes Syria.
Okay, so moving into the second millennium BC, the picture gets even busier. The Amorites and the Hittites enter the scene.
Exactly. The Amorites, they start out as semi-nomadic from Mesopotamia, but they settle down, found major cities like Babylon around 1900 BC.
And their culture is described as a blend, right? Chaldean, Syrian, Egyptian elements mixed together.
Yeah, and you see their development reflected in things like the Law Code of Hammurabi, which some sources date around 2200 BC, though dating can be tricky that far back.
Meanwhile, the Hittites are coming in from Anatolia, described as more aggressive.
Definitely more aggressive, yeah. Their empire hits its peak around 1350 to 1200 BC, under rulers like Sipiluli-Umai. But the sources describe it less as one solid block, more like an amalgamation, little kingdoms, vassal states held together.
Interesting. So not just brute force.
No, despite their power, they seem to have kept up significant cultural, commercial ties. And importantly, the sources suggest they showed respect for local traditions and laws. We see evidence like Proto-Hittite sanctuaries in these areas.
Okay, switching gears slightly, but staying with huge contributions. Your sources really hammer home Syria's role in developing the Phoenician alphabet.
Oh, absolutely critical. Foundational, really, for recording knowledge, science, everything that follows.
A massive step for human history.
It really was. And tracking the earliest forms is tough. The materials were fragile, papyrus and such. But the sources emphasize Syria was crucial in shaping the actual modes of shapes and letters before the Phoenicians took it wide.
And the Phoenicians, of course, they become famous traders, setting up colonies all over the Med-Carthage, Cyprus.
Right. But the sources note this early alphabet was complex. It didn't have, early drafts we can find, or even vowel letters initially, which leads to this interesting idea, maybe vowels developed elsewhere, Ethiopia, Arabia, somewhere like that.
Huh. Fascinating. So after these ancient periods, the dawn of writing, the sources kind of fast forward through the Roman and Byzantine eras.
Relatively quickly, yeah. The main point there seems to be that after about 2,000 years under Greek and Roman influence, this whole territory eventually comes under the sway of a new major force, Islam.
Which brings us to a really seismic shift, the Arab Revolution, starting 7th century CE, the rise of Islam.
Indeed. And the sources spend quite a bit of time on the Umayyad Caliphate. They're the ones who moved the center of Islamic power to Damascus in 661 CE under Muawiyah Qust.
And he wasn't just any caliph, right? He'd been governor of Syria for like 20 years.
Exactly. So he knew the region, and he fundamentally changed the game by making the caliphate hereditary, establishing his dynasty.
But the sources also point out there was criticism of him, some calling his actions un-Islamic or undermining the prophet's family.
Yes, that tension is noted. But despite that, the Umayyads oversaw this massive expansion, North Africa, Central Asia. Islam spreads rapidly.
And their methods are detailed.
Yeah, the sources mention things like monopolizing public education, giving local elites power and wealth if they converted, even forbidding others from ruling or using their own languages officially.
So incentives and restrictions.
A combination. And Damascus becomes this major hub, right? Huge architectural projects, the Dome of the Rock, the Great Mosque. Though apparently, out of caution, they moved the core administration and army over to Iraq.
But eventually, the Umayyads fall. Revolts. Defeats.
Right. Though one famous story the sources mention is Abd al-Rahman, an Umayyad prince who escapes all the way to Spain and founds this flourishing emirate there, a whole separate chapter.
Wow. And back in Syria.
The Abbasids rise up. They eventually eclipse the Umayyads, though they coexisted for a while. The sources point to Tadmor, or Palmyra, as an early Islamic town in Syria known for its distinctive ashlar stone ruins.
So the Abbasids take over in 750 CE. Their origins are interesting, too, supported by non-Arabs, Jews, Shiites initially.
Yes, it was a broad coalition in that initial rebellion. And while they started out relatively tolerant, the sources describe a shift towards persecution later on. Big change. They move the capital east to Baghdad in 762 CE. That becomes the new center.
And their court culture sounds quite different, more elaborate.
Very much so. Reflecting their wealth, emulating Persian and Byzantine styles, aesthetics.
And the bureaucracy under them sounds like it became incredibly powerful.
Hugely. They recruited vast numbers of non-Arabs into key roles. Bureaucrats, soldiers, even religious authorities. Persians, Berbers.
So the center of the Islamic world really shifts eastward.
Exactly. Asia becomes primary. Africa, Europe more peripheral. The population itself becomes predominantly non-Arab in the corridors of power, even though Arabic remains the official language, the lingua franca.
And the court protocols, mimicking older empires that increase the distance from the early days of Islam.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. A growing gap between the ruling elite and the sort of prophetic legitimacy of the early community.
Okay, moving forward in time, the sources detail the huge impact of the Crusades.
Yeah, a major disruption, not just military campaigns, but mobilizing a whole European, specifically Christian identity. It caused a political crisis across the Islamic world.
But the flip side, according to the sources, is that Islam itself responded, becoming a more powerful unifying force.
It did. It gained renewed energy in response. The initial Crusader momentum, successful in establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem, eventually waned by the 13th century as the Islamic world adapted and pushed back.
Early on, expansion into Syria itself was tough for the Crusaders. Lack of resources.
Yeah. Limited resources, organization. They took some Muslim cities, sometimes when local rulers were busy fighting each other, But a key turning point described is a battle in 1119. Apparently, it nearly wiped out a main Crusader army, leaving their Syrian holdings really vulnerable.
And that sparked a reaction.
It did. A temporary unification among Muslim principalities, boosting their strength and laying the groundwork for a more organized holy war or jihad.
But in another battle, 1129 shifted things again, allowed the Crusaders to build those massive fortresses we still see.
Right, like Crac de Chevalier, that went back on the offensive, brought military innovations. But ultimately, the growing religious unity among Muslims led to comprehensive mobilization. Big victories like the Battle of Inab really crippled the Crusader states.
So they survived, but became more focused on their own survival, less of a united threat.
Exactly, more dynastic, focused internally, rather than this unified front pushing outwards.
Okay, so after the Crusades ebb and flow and other regional powers rise and fall, the sources bring us to the Ottomans.
Right. From the end of the 16th century, after they conquer Mamluk Egypt, Arabic Syria becomes, a core part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries.
And there were attempts at Turkishization, reforms, But World War I stopped those.
Pretty much. The administration structure changed over time, too. Governed from Egypt initially, then independent governors after Napoleon's brief invasion shook things up. It got divided into main provinces: Damascus, Aleppo, Sidon, Tripoli, run by councils and governors.
But then further divisions into smaller units.
Yeah, the sources describe later divisions into smaller cities, districts, and this process, maybe alongside other factors, is noted as weakening the Sharia court's authority, messing up the financial system. There's even mention of things like tax policies and false speeches contributing to the decay of big cities like Aleppo and Tripoli.
It sounds like a period with significant unrest brewing.
Definitely. The sources highlight a major rebellion in 1860 sparked by perceived injustices. Tragically, hundreds of thousands died, including thousands of Christians targeted in sectarian violence. Then another uprising in Sidon and Beirut in 1867.
And the Ottoman response? Not very effective.
Tellingly, they sent a centralized army rather than granting more autonomy. And the generals were often described as unskilled. It didn't really solve the underlying issues long term.
What about culture during this long Ottoman period?
The sources paint a picture of cultural preservation suffering quite badly. Described as delayed, meager. Antiquities were smuggled out. Important Syrian artifacts like the 9th century Syrian alum ended up in Istanbul, not necessarily preserved well. Records got destroyed in places like Aleppo. Even oral traditions, especially scientific ones, faded.
The loss of knowledge.
A significant loss. Yet the sources also note the Arabic language itself remained vibrant, linked to poetry, proverbs. Syria is highlighted as having some of the oldest Arabic literary materials from the 3rd century CE. Local grammarians were active.
So the language evolved.
Yeah, from a very formal High Arabic to more common usage, which got documented in books on dialects. Some traditional genres declined, but others, like storytelling Aleppo, was famous for its jokers and storytellers back in the 12th century. Those flourished at times.
Okay, let's jump forward dramatically. End of World War I, Ottoman Empire collapses.
And the sources paint this picture of nations suddenly feeling free, but totally unprepared for actual statehood. Syria and Lebanon having had some autonomy, had resources, history, geographic advantages, really.
But independence wasn't on the cards immediately. Instead, the French Mandate, described quite harshly in the sources, forced upon Syria.
Yeah, through outside machinations. The language used is strong, aimed to rend her finely woven frame, creating what felt like a prison chamber. The idea of democracy meant completely different things to the rulers and the ruled.
The advantages brought by the French are described almost sarcastically.
Very much so. Ranging from gentle representation to ferocious disarmament, lone basis to abject vassalage. It really cemented this perception, the sources say, that Europeans saw themselves as immeasurably superior.
And this is all happening against that backdrop of Syria's incredibly ancient history going back 5,000 years, Semites taking over from Sumerians, Canaanite states flourishing.
Always a target because of those trade routes. That deep history is crucial for understanding the rise of Syrian nationalism.
Which the sources trace back to the Arab cultural renaissance, al-Nahda, late 19th century.
Exactly. Arab intellectuals pushing to revive Arab civilization through education, culture, science, engineering, humanistic thought, a call that echoed across the Ottoman lands.
Early Syrian nationalists focused mostly on culture first.
Initially, yeah. Limited political impact at first, but Syrians were very active, editing Arabic newspapers, journals within the Ottoman Empire, setting up literary societies.
And then it spilled into politics.
Gradually, yes. Especially after clashes with the Ottomans. Some nationalists fled to Egypt, formed associations there, but the sources suggest direct Arab nationalist influence in Syria was still limited right before WWI.
So, post-WWI, hopes for independence were sky high. But then dashed by partition.
Completely dashed. The sources are blunt. The territory was carved up. British took Transjordan, Palestine. Italians got some coastal access. French got the interior of Syria. Not much input from the locals.
And the French imposed their rule by force.
Overwhelming force. That dream of an independent Syrian Arab kingdom declared by Faisal, crushed at the Battle of Maysalun, July 1920. General Surreal's forces. The sources call this the moment that ended that hope for a generation. Just despair.
And then the French divide and rule strategy from 1921?
Deliberate policy, breaking Syria into smaller bits based on religion, sect, even creating separate statelets for Druze, Alawites, trying to break up nationalist sentiment.
Did it improve security, as some sources suggest?
Maybe in some narrow sense in some places, but the sources emphasize it came at a terrible cost huge loss of life, and it massively deepened those internal sectarian divisions, poisoning the well for the future, really.
But resistance continued.
Oh, yes. Arab resistance, revolts against the French, persisted. Nationalist ideas were central. The French tried imposing their language in schools, used their military sometimes with Syrian soldiers they'd trained to suppress uprisings, though ironically, some of those French-trained officers later became key nationalists.
Until independence finally came in 1946.
Finally. But post-independence was hardly straightforward. That 1920 promise was long dead. And while decolonization was happening elsewhere after WWII, Syria's legitimacy was based on this UN mandate framework, and the remnants of colonial structures just fueled conflict, tribes, sects, religions clashing.
The sources suggest states with more homogeneity had an easier time.
That's the implication, yeah. Syria's diversity, exacerbated by the mandate policies, made unity incredibly challenging.
The 1950s sound particularly unstable.
Very. Attempts by the traditional ruling elite failed. A prime minister assassinated. The army steps in to dissolve a movement in 57, wrecking the elite's legitimacy. Nationalization policies failed. Living standards dropped, fueling discontent, especially among people moving from rural areas, unemployed students.
And this created fertile ground for the Baathists.
Exactly. Their popularity grew, especially among refugees on the outskirts of cities. This all builds towards the bloodless coup in March 1963.
Led by a group described as the poorest ever ruling elite in terms of property, education.
That's the striking phrase used, yeah. They basically kicked out or jailed the old guard.
And the key figure who emerges is Hafez al-Assad, Alawite general, head of military security.
Right. And the Ba'ath Party becomes the only party, all others banned. Crucially, the sources highlight the rest of the army didn't step in to stop the coup. That was decisive.
The sources then detail the repression under this new regime. Pretty grim.
Very grim. Opponents purged immediately. Uprisings, like one by the Muslim Brotherhood in Aleppo in 64, were crushed brutally by the army. Revenge acts were common. And prisons like al-Rashidiyya Regiment gained this horrific notoriety in the 60s. Starvation, torture, just rampant violence described in the sources.
Let's dig into the Ba'ath Party's policies a bit more.
Yeah.
And Hafez al-Assad's consolidation of power. The Baathists were actually involved in politics earlier, right? Elected in 1950.
They were part of the government. And Syria was actually ahead of the curve in the Arab world, with land reforms, limiting ownership, redistributing land quite early on.
They also sought Soviet aid early, from 48.
Yes, leading to investment in industry, oil refineries in Homs and Banayas, dams, cotton cultivation. The sources call it a unique period for the region, building this integrated economy using local resources. Though post-independence trade was still mostly regional, kind of unregulated at first, but after the 66 coup, the Ba'athists really locked down their power monopoly. Damascus pushed Arab socialism, mass mobilization, defending the economy.
Their charter mixed secular libertarian socialist ideas. Wealth redistribution was key.
It was. Aiming to address that massive inequality, the sources mention 95% supposedly left destitute after independence, fueling discontent.
And the proliferation of all these different groups, unions, militias, showed a lack of real political representation.
That's how the sources interpret it, yeah. Different groups vying for legitimacy, challenging the government.
So when Hafez al-Assad takes sole control after his 1970 coup, what's his strategy?
Consolidating his personal power. Moderating the Ba'ath Party itself, treating it almost as a rival. And crucially, the sources point to him leveraging ethnic and religious ties. Alawites, his minority group, only 3.4% of the population, came to dominate the army officer corps, over half. Command filled with his relatives, people from his hometown.
A classic power consolidation tactic.
Absolutely. Purging rivals, crushing any opposition with, as the sources put it, savage repression. This breeds discontent alongside the political tensions, economic crises. And the sources also mention the rise of a big personality cult around him.
Then his son, Bashar, takes over in 2000. Initially seen as a potential reformer.
There was some hope, yeah. Maybe a transition figure, but according to the sources, within 6 months, bang, draconian sanctions on information, expression, organization, emergency laws back, public critique vanished, radio curtailed.
So the repression just continued.
It did, right through the period described as the Civil War. And while the regime later claimed victory over the Arab Spring protests, the sources emphasized the devastating cost. Figures cited like 1.3 million deaths, 17.5 million displaced, hundreds of billions in damages, just unimaginable scars on society.
Which brings us to contemporary Syria, 21st century. described as fundamentally changed.
Organized differently, yeah. Post 9/11, isolation increased. Then the U.S. intervention in Iraq next door really weakened the Syrian state, created space, the sources argue, for all sorts of groups to rise: terrorist, criminal, religious, often backed by outside powers.
And ISIS emerges in this context around 2014.
Right. Initially, some saw them just as fighting the regime, but their rivalry with other groups, their brutality, led to U.S. military intervention, which, the sources note, caused massive damage itself, especially in places like Aleppo, crippling the Syrian state further.
Then another major player enters, Prussia, in 2015.
A huge shift. Assad saw it as proof his regime needed saving, perhaps. But the sources also give the Russian view, stopping U.S. influence spreading in their perceived turf. By early 2016, you get the ceasefire, leading to a very complex peace process involving everyone: Iran, Turkey, Russia, America, France, Saudi Arabia, a real tangle.
In Syria today, the picture painted is bleak, shattered, disintegrating.
Socially, politically, religiously, economically, yes. Becoming more like Lebanon in its fragmentation, the sources suggest. Ethnic, religious groups fighting, their divisions exploited by foreign powers for their own gain. A serious loss of actual sovereignty.
So the state's power has really declined compared to regional players like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and global ones like the U.S., Russia, Israel.
That's the assessment in the sources, yeah. And the economy is described as effectively destroyed, widespread poverty. And, chillingly, the threat of actual hunger for the first time since just after World War II.
The Civil War itself, starting March 2011, it began peacefully, like other Arab Spring protests.
It did. People calling for reform, release of prisoners, peaceful at first.
But the regime crackdown was violent.
Extremely violent, which provoked armed opposition. Self-defense committees turned into militias, freedom fighters. They gained ground initially, but the sources are clear. The opposition became hopelessly fragmented. Different funding sources, different ideologies, different agendas. It plagued the revolution.
And the rise of ISIS changed the game after about 3 years.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
Added a whole new, brutal layer. Even after ISIS was pushed out territorially, they remain a threat, especially next door in Iraq. And the sources also note the power of Kurdish forces, the PKK-YPG, in the north. The war basically fractured that idea of a unified Syria, allowing for this semi-autonomous Kurdish region.
And all this conflict was fueled by outside players.
Deeply intertwined, yes. The Arab Spring reshaped the whole region. Sectarian tensions were massively exploited and inflamed Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, Turkey often backing one side, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Russia the other. Regional powers jumped in, pursuing their own goals by playing on grievances, pushing sectarian narratives.
Thinking about that international involvement, the sources trace it way back, post-WWI, League of Nations worrying about minorities.
Yeah, that early concern was there. Alongside the secret deals, of course, like the British and French carving up the Ottoman Empire. Then Syria becomes a French mandate at San Remo in 1920.
The sources also revisit Syria's geography, that land bridge idea, always a theater of events next to British interests coveted by Germany, Russia.
Its natural regions, resources, its incredibly diverse population, Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Syrians, which Ottoman rule often just ignored. Emigration was a factor too. French rule concentrated in certain towns. Maybe commerce cushioned the blow for some, but the divisions were always there.
And regional politics today are just saturated with this history, right? Grievances from partition, Israel's creation.
Absolutely. These grievances became central to legitimizing the Syrian state, its Arab nationalist identity, the Assad regime itself. Radical Arab nationalism is presented as a direct result of these experiences.
Victimhood focused on Israel became key.
Very much so. Supporting Palestinian fighters led to the '67 war, losing the Golan Heights. Getting the Golan back became this point of national honor, regime legitimacy.
So foreign policy focused on that, plus deterring Israel, maybe with chemical weapons as a counterweight to Israel's assumed nuclear capability.
That's the logic presented, yeah. Fewer resources than Israel, so needing a deterrent, feeling insecure as a smaller state, with borders violated by Israel, the U.S.
And perceived Western double standards fueled this. Chemical versus nuclear.
That view is definitely mentioned. The argument being, state interests only count if you have power. Hafez al-Assad eventually narrowed the aim from broad liberation to specifically Golan and a Palestinian state, shifting the conflict towards political maneuvering.
A fragile peace held, using proxies like Hezbollah for limited pressure.
That's how the sources describe it. Syria's foreign relations constantly try to balance security, regional goals, economic needs, sometimes aligned with the Soviets, sometimes more pragmatic, even rapprochement with the U.S. after '67.
Post-Soviet era, more complex balancing, security cooperation with the U.S. sometimes.
Yeah, weighing national interest versus Arab solidarity versus Western ties,
Yeah.
mediating in Iraq, Lebanon crises, worried about the destabilizing Iraq-Iran war while trying to work with Gulf states.
The 90s sound tough. Arab-Israeli stalemate, domestic issues, economic liberalization causing problems.
A difficult mix. Late 90s, maybe a chance for a pro-Western shift, U.S. attention. But then Golan talks broke down diplomatic aphasia, the sources call it. Relations shifted towards Latin America, Africa, replacing lost Arab international support.
So, end of the 90s. Austerity, isolation. And attempts at peace with Israel actually made things worse internally for the regime.
That's a provocative idea in the sources, yes. That normalization attempts might have highlighted the regime's own obsolescence, its internal problems, maybe contributing to the pressure cooker that eventually exploded.
And that explosion brings us to the humanitarian crisis. The sources describe Syria's situation since 2011 as just shocking, like a kaleidoscope of extreme tragic changes.
From relatively stable, maybe 20 deaths a day, the sources estimate to this immense tragedy. Since March 2011, 70,000 deaths cited, over 100,000 detained, thousands tortured, dying in detention.
And the sources ask why such brutal means. Artillery, bombers against protesters, unlike, say, the initial responses in Tunisia or Egypt.
They point to a mix, long-term social, cultural, political factors building up, plus the short-term spark from elsewhere in the Arab Spring.
The displacement, the refugee crisis, unprecedented scale between 2011 and 2015.
Utterly unprecedented. Millions fleeing unbelievable violence, bombardment, gas, hunger, destruction, detention, torture, death. The sources state clearly, victims of a regime warring against its own population using violence and intelligence networks.
And this flood overwhelmed the region. Refugees face terrible dangers.
Horrific dangers. Falling prey to human predators facing electronic torture, extortion, forced confinement, rape, informants, forced recruitment. Caught between rival factions, support networks collapsing, old rivalry sectarian, ethnic, regional weaponized, creating new conflicts.
The example of the wealthy refugee imprisoned for his wrong background is chilling.
It really is. And by 2016, hostility towards refugees was widespread, even in places like Lebanon that had taken in so many.
What about international aid efforts? Huge need, right?
Immense. 2 million needing aid in 2015 alone. You've got humanitarian aid, military development. Focusing on humanitarian, there's emergency relief and longer-term help. But the FTS figures for 2015 show this alarming gap. Over $7 billion needed, maybe $5.8 billion donated, but only $4 billion actually received.
A huge shortfall. Who are the main providers?
UN agencies like the World Food Program, UNHCR for refugees, ICRC for medical, detention support, water, but even aid convoys were attacked in 2015. Local NGOs like the Syrian Red Crescent channeling aid from Damascus became vital too.
And the sources raise a really difficult point that aid itself might sometimes be fueling the conflict.
Yes, it's a complex point raised, though not elaborated in huge detail in the summary provided. The idea that aid, maybe unintentionally, gets diverted or manipulated in ways that prolong the fighting, with wider implications. A really tough issue.
Stepping back again, the sources remind us of Syria's incredible cultural heritage, a cradle of civilization.
Truly. Traces of human tools going back 1 million years in Al-Kabr. Artifacts from countless ages.
Monumental sites, Abla, 29th century BC, UNESCO site, those cuneiform tablets, Palmyra, that 2,000-year-old Roman city.
Stunning places. And early Christian heritage, too. St. Simeon Monastery, Byzantine churches in Aleppo, Damascus.
But so vulnerable, especially in war.
Terribly vulnerable. Sites targeted, destroyed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes just caught in the crossfire. Heavy machinery, explosives. It's not just buildings. The source is stress. It's erasing memory within cities, jobs, ideas, histories, languages disappearing.
How is history itself taught in Syria, according to the sources?
Predominantly state-run Mandakorian schools. Official textbooks since the 70s, 80s, covering Syria, the Arab world, world history, all in Arabic. Very few non-official historical publications. From 7th grade, the focus is heavily on Syria as an Arab nation-state, its history tied to the Arab world, needing Arab consciousness for unity. Even geography texts have this defensive posture towards neighbors.
So the state uses history education to legitimize itself.
That's the clear implication. History plays this fundamental role in constructing and perpetuating the state's official interpretation.
Looking at social structure again post-Napoleon under the Ottomans, it was complexly divided, and relations were described starkly in the 1870s as they hate one another.
A blunt assessment from the sources, yeah. Sunnis were the majority, formed the traditional social elite landowners who ruled independent Syria initially.
Agriculture-based economy, dominated by the small elite. First President al-Quwatli from this group.
Correct. But post-WWII economic problems, the 48 war failure, sparked protests. Trying to use the army against protesters in late 48 backfired, led to the idea of a coup, which happened in 49 under Husni al-Zaim.
And his modernization attempts caused friction. Women's voting, face coverings, plus higher taxes.
Yes, stirred opposition. Increased taxes for the army, seen as weak against Israel, didn't help. And that Trans-Arabian pipeline deal with the U.S., the sources link it to CIA support for his coup, but Arab nationalists saw it as selling out to Zionism and the West.
Syria's ethnic and religious diversity is described as remarkable, inhabited for 15,000 plus years.
Incredible diversity. Pre-war, 90% Arab, Muslims and Christians, then 10% Kurds, Arameans, Druze, Turkmen, Armenians, Circassians. Unevenly spread. No other Arab country quite like it, the sources say, further divided by sects within those groups.
A complex mosaic.
Very. Groups coexisting, sometimes clashing, especially after 2011. Sometimes secular coexistence, sometimes ancient traditions holding sway. Sunni tribes, like the Shumar, often had bad relations with city leaders under the Ottomans over taxes, leading to revolts. Tribal culture remained strong. Even recently, until the war, big tribes effectively ruled large areas.
The sources also touch briefly on women's roles, linking it to secular regimes and gender policy via personal status codes, but then quickly pivot to the Arab Spring context.
Yes, it's an interesting jump in the material provided. It connects the surprise many felt at the Damascus uprising to analyses of why Hafez al-Assad's regime seemed so durable. That iron fist, regional influence, it persisted despite economic woes, drought, embargoes, things that should have weakened it but maybe didn't, or even reinforced control somehow.
Wahhabi Islam seen as suppressed in his police state.
That's mentioned, yeah. Bashar's initial reforms were expected to be slow, the opposition looked fractured, and the Arab Spring started elsewhere, Tunisia, Egypt, where initial lighter crackdowns proved unsustainable.
So Syria, like Egypt or Jordan with strong security states, or the Gulf with oil money, or tribal Yemen, Libya, seemed more entrenched initially.
That was the perception some analysts had, according to the sources, which made the eventual uprising in Syria and the sheer brutality of the regime's response particularly stark and shocking.
Wow. What an incredible sweep of history. From, the earliest human traces, ancient empires, all the way through layers of conquest, nationalism, and then this tragic, complex situation today. It just hammers home how Syria's deep past is so fundamentally tied to its present.
Absolutely. Going through these sources, you just see these patterns repeating, don't you? External powers intervening, those persistent internal divisions, the constant struggle for identity and control over this vital piece of land. The material gives such a detailed, layered view of those forces.
Yeah, and it's striking how specific things from the past, like ancient trade routes or the legacies of different empires, even how administrators drew lines on a map centuries ago, still echo today. And the human details really bring it home. Those descriptions of torture from the 60s or that shocking gap in aid figures more recently, it makes it very real.
Exactly. It just reinforces that history isn't, just dates and names. It's about people, it's about culture, and the very long-term consequences, often devastating, of decisions and conflicts. And the destruction of ancient sites is such a stark reminder of how fragile all that heritage is.
It seems clear if you really want to understand what's happening in Syria now, you absolutely have to look back. Way back. This deep dive through your sources has certainly given us a huge amount to think about.
Indeed it has. And perhaps the provocative thought to maybe leave you with, drawing from these recurring themes, is this. Given Syria's incredibly long history as this crossroads, constantly shaped by outside forces and internal fractures, can any purely Syrian solution ever really emerge from its current crisis? Or is its fate always going to be, in some way, tied to the interests and interventions of powers beyond its own borders?
That is a challenging thought, and one definitely worth mulling over after everything we've discussed. Thank you so much for bringing these sources to our attention and for joining us on this really insightful deep dive.